Well, good morning, everyone. So today is the third Sunday in Lent. This is the time of year when Christians do a little spring cleaning in their lives. Is anyone getting rid of anything in their lives this year for Lent? Okay. Sometimes Christians give up something for Lent, like chocolate or like coffee. I'm not one quite to give up coffee, not unless there's salvation on the line. Other Christians add a spiritual discipline like reading the Bible daily or like praying before dinner every night or like helping out. Like the women are helping out at the Friendship Center coming up real soon to do something positive instead of taking something away. Lent, it's the good time of year to give up a bad habit, and it's the good time of year to pick up a good habit, okay? And the season of Lent is also a really good time to look at some of the stories of Jesus, because the parables of Jesus are really good at grabbing our attention and helping remind us, oh wow, I may have been a Christian my whole life, but I still have a lot of growing to do, okay? And so for the third week in a row, we're going to the Gospel of Luke, and we're going to look at his parables, which hopefully we find convicting. 2 weeks ago, the first Sunday of Lent, we heard about the Good Samaritan. And that story should convict us. It should still be convicting us a couple weeks later that we need to love all of our neighbors, including the neighbors who bug us most. Does anyone still find that convicting 2 weeks later? Some reluctant hands. I find it convicting 2 weeks later. The reminder that, oh yeah, even the person that bothers me, it's my job to love them. Then last Sunday we talked about Jesus' image, that he's a mother hen that wants to gather us all in under his love. And only by sacrificial love do we change the world. Not by tools of power, not by the weapons of war, but only by the power of sacrificial love can we actually see the world change for the better. That's also convicting for me. Today, we turn to maybe the most famous parable in the Gospel of Luke. And it's only in the Gospel of Luke. Chapter 15 in the Gospel of Luke are the parables of lostness. I just told the kids the parable of the lost sheep. There's also the parable of the lost coin. And then you get to the parable of the prodigal son, the lost son. Although that's not the best name for this parable. And we'll talk about that more in a moment. This parable should convict us just as much as the others. And maybe you don't feel particularly lost. Maybe you don't relate to the prodigal son. If that's the case, good. Pay attention to the older son. Because if you don't feel like you're lost, you probably feel like you're already found. And if you feel like you're already found, there's a lot of gospel and a lot of conviction to be heard in this parable as well. So let's turn to chapter 15 in the Gospel of Luke, verses 11 through 32. It's a longer piece of scripture. Hear the good news. Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to the father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided the property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had, set off for a distant country, and squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to the fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with what the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son. He threw his arms around him and he kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. This son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him, 'What is going on?' 'Your brother came home,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I have been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never even gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him?' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He's lost, and now he's found.'" The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, point number one. One son embarrassed his father with sin. Okay, point number one. One son embarrassed his father with sin. Now, the youngest son, he shamed the father by asking for his inheritance early. Traditional Middle Eastern fathers, hearing a request like this, would slap their son and kick them out of the house. That is the normal Middle Eastern response for this kind of request. This parable is the only example in Middle Eastern literature of a son asking for his inheritance early. What he's really asking for, the subtext of the story is, what the son is really saying, "Dad, I wish you were dead already so I could have my share of the inheritance now." Kenneth Bailey is a scholar who studied in the Middle East, worked in the Middle East as a missionary, as a teacher, as a preacher for 40 years. And he asked hundreds of people from all walks of life, from Morocco to India, from Turkey to Sudan, about the prodigal son story. He would take the story and say, "What do you make of this," right? In this Middle Eastern culture. And here's a sample of how people responded when he told them the parable of the prodigal son. "Never! Has anyone ever made such a request in your village? Impossible." His father would beat him, of course. The request means he wants his father to die. In our story, the compassionate father does not hit his son. He does not kick him out of the house. Jesus' original audience, when they heard this story, would have been appalled that the father does what the youngest son asks him to do. We're so used to the story, we miss that the original audience would be horrified that the old man did what he did. I always like to say that you know more Greek than you realize. Who took biology in high school? Anyone take biology? Anyone remember what bio means? Life. It means life. See? So, biology means life, or bio means life. And biology is the study of life. The word in the original Greek text here is bio. Okay? That's the word that's being translated as property in today's text. He's not just dividing his money. He's not just dividing his stuff. Quite literally in the Greek, he's dividing his bio. He's dividing his very life between the two boys. Who's an older son in the congregation? Any older sons? Yeah, older sons get 2/3 of the property. Give me a woohoo. Where's a woohoo? Okay. Any younger sons in the congregation? Okay. Yeah, we get less than 2/3. Okay. So, yeah, we get less than 1/3. Excuse me. I misspoke. Thank you. Thank you for catching me. Yeah, it's more like 2/9 what we get, Eli. Does that seem fair to you? Maybe that's why there's some resentment towards dad. I don't know. But about 2/9 of the property goes to the youngest son. Any daughters out there? Yeah, it's not fair. Yeah, like 1/9 in the dowry. No, it's not fair. It's just not fair. That's the way the world worked at that time, okay? The point is not who gets what, although it is unfair, and that's part of the story. The point is the father is willing to divide his very life between these two boys that he loves. Both of them he loves. The younger son, he humiliates his dad further by quickly selling off his lifetime of possessions, and his behavior is so shameful that presumably he had to move to a foreign country because he was such an embarrassment to the family name, right? The prodigal son commits another great sin by going to a foreign country and squandering his father's property. Now, the rumor back home is that he wasted his money on prostitutes. That's what the older brother says later. We don't know that that's actually what happened, but maybe it was. When he runs out of cash, he ends up working at a pig farm. For the original audience, they're terribly offended by this because Jews don't eat pigs. And to end up wishing you got the food that the pigs eat is a fate worse than death. It's a colorful story. 2, another son embarrassed his father with self-righteousness. It's not quite accurate to call this story the parable of the prodigal son. Jesus never calls it that. The Gospel of Luke never calls it that. That's just a title that someone put on this story, and we've called it that ever since. So much so that you can't talk about the story without calling the younger son the prodigal, which is the same word as prodigious, okay? Same root word, right? Today's parable is not about one lost son. It's about 2 lost sons. One son lost in sin, another son lost in self-righteousness. Okay? When we think of it as the prodigal son, we think of sinners and we think that they're in their proper place. If you read the story correctly, it's about 2 sons, each who are distant from the father because of their own bad choices. Neither one of these sons gets to come home in the story. Neither one without compassion from the father. Now, the older brother, he showed up after a long day of working in the fields, and he hears the music playing, and he hears the feet stomping and dancing, and he smells the fatted calf sizzling on the barbecue, and the confused older brother, he grabs a servant and says, "What is going on?" The servant boy explains that the father is throwing a homecoming party for his rebellious little brother. The big brother was furious and he refused to join the party. Just as a point in the story, who does the fatted calf belong to at this point in the story? No. He divided his property. Who owns the fatted calf? The older brother owns the fatted calf. In those days, it was rare to eat meat, okay? When the father killed the fatted calf, it was an invitation for the whole neighborhood to show up at his house and enjoy barbecue and to celebrate the return of this wayward son. The father wanted the whole neighborhood to forget the sinful past of his younger son. And the older son is expected to lead the celebration, to lead the party, to voluntarily give up the fatted calf. The father is just taking and slaughtering the fatted calf without the permission of the older son because it's just assumed. Yes, let us welcome home your little brother. You won't mind, will you, son? But the firstborn son might actually dishonor his father more by refusing to participate in the party, by refusing to participate in the reconciliation of this family and the reconciliation of the community. To put the story in contemporary terms, think of yourself as the older brother, and you're expected to come home for a family wedding for your little brother. But instead of putting on your tuxedo and showing up at the wedding party to celebrate, to stand by your brother, to act like best man, you stand outside the church door and you cross your arms and you say, I just disapprove of this wedding. And your father spends $50,000 to rent some swanky country club and to invite all of his business partners and all of his family and all of his friends. And then as the older brother to show up just as they're cutting the cake and to chew out the father for throwing a party for a wayward son. That's the kind of dishonor that's in this text that we don't hear because we've heard the story so many times. That's the kind of shame he's heaping on his family. That's the kind of shame he's heaping on his father. The older son thought he was righteous, but he committed the exact same sin of dishonoring his father. Okay? It's the same sin, but it's compounded by the sin of self-righteousness. Not the sin of wasting away, but denying grace even to his younger brother. My third point is that the father overcomes shame with compassion. The father overcomes the family's shame with compassion. If you have shame in your history, if you have shame in your family, you know compassion is the way that we get out of that. The younger son, he shamed the father with sin. The older son shamed his father with self-righteousness. Both boys are separated from the father by their own dumb choices, and the only way that dad is going to bring everyone together is with compassion. The father saw the prodigal son coming from a great distance. That tells us he must have been waiting, he must have been watching for his son to come home. In that culture, old men did not run. As I recover from ACL surgery, I understand why old men did not run. No one was doing surgery in those days for old men with snapped ACL tendons. Old men did not run. This old man ran. He picked up his skirts, and he showed his pale, skinny, non-runner legs to all the world, and he ran to his youngest son when he came home after living a life of sin. Why does he run? The book of, he's not just excited. The book of Deuteronomy suggests that rebellious sons should be taken to the city gate and stoned to death by the town elders. The father does not want someone throwing stones at his long-lost boy. He really could be dead in today's story, coming back like this. So what does he do? He covers the son in his own fancy robe. He covers the son in his own family ring. He covers the son by putting new sandals on the feet. He's marking his boy, saying, "Don't you touch him. This is my boy. He is covered in my compassion. He is covered in my love. Now, let's have a barbecue so he can reconcile with the whole neighborhood. Because once you come to my house and you eat of my fatted calf, you are saying, yes, this son is welcome back into the community, even though he did terrible things." The father is overcoming public shame by explicit compassion. You know, the father also chased after the older son, who is just as guilty and just as in danger of being stoned to death at the city gate for rebelling against his father. He's just as liable to be put to death. Dad leaves the party in order to beg. He's begging. He's begging his older son, "Come on home. Welcome home your little brother." It is embarrassing for an old man to lift up his skirts and show his skinny, pale legs to the whole community, running to protect his son. It's even more embarrassing to leave the party and to beg and to plead, "Your older son, come on home." Because this boy's not going to be reconciled until you come home. And the big brother makes a scene. And he unleashes a lifetime of frustration on Dad. "How can you, Dad? You killed the fatted calf." My fatted calf, by the way. "You never even gave me a goat to sacrifice with my friends." Who owns the goats right now? He owns the goats. He always had the freedom to kill a goat. Instead of responding with anger, instead of slapping his son, instead of kicking him out of the house, the old man uses the tool of compassion. He is absolutely shameless about his love for both his boys. He degrades himself in public again to save the older son. Once again, faced with public humiliation, the father uses compassion to overcome their mistakes. Have you ever noticed that Jesus never finishes the story of the prodigal son? Have you ever noticed that? There's no ending to the story. We know that the prodigal accepts the father's compassion and is welcomed home, but we never find out. We never know if the older brother swallows his pride and joins the party. And the reason for that is because Jesus knows the kind of people who are going to show up at church need a little reminder to put on the sandals of the older brother and to walk a few miles in his footsteps, to realize, am I going to be a person of self-righteousness who says, "I belong and you do not"? Or am I going to be a person of the gospel who gives compassion as the way to overcome shame at work in the world? Am I here because of self-righteousness? Or am I here because I need compassion and I'm committed to giving compassion? So the question that we are left with at the end of the parable is, am I outside the party in my self-righteous pride? Or am I finally stepping into the party of the gospel and offering compassion to anyone and everyone who's willing to follow Jesus? I tell you, it doesn't really matter if you have an embarrassing problem with sin or if you have an embarrassing problem with self-righteousness. The remedy is exactly the same. You need the shameless compassion of God the Father. Either way, whichever son you relate to more in the story, you need the shameless compassion of God the Father Almighty. God the Father sent his Son, Jesus Christ, to overcome our humiliation with his love and to drag us into the party, either covering us up from all the mistakes that we've made, all the shame that we feel, or by just beckoning us, come on, drop the pride, drop the self-righteousness, humble yourself and receive the mercy of God. Either way, Jesus wants you at the party. Both you prodigals and you perfectionists. As the book of Romans says, anyone who believes in Jesus will never be put to shame. This is the parable that will overcome the shame in your life, whether it's because you have sinned or whether it's because you've rejected people in your self-righteousness. And the answer is exactly the same. Receive the compassion. Receive the mercy. Receive the grace of God the Father Almighty. That's how you get to the party. That's how you belong, by God's grace alone. And all God's people said, amen.